In the early months of 1945, World War II entered its most brutal final phase. After more than 3 years of sweeping victories, the Japanese Empire had once stood at the height of its power in the Pacific, with lightning successes at Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and Singapore. But it gradually lost momentum, being stopped and pushed back step by step under the tightening grip of the United States and its allies. From mid-1942, after the fateful defeat at Midway, the Imperial Navy suffered heavy setbacks. The Central Pacific Islands fell one after another to the Americans in bloody campaigns: Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, and Peleliu. Each advance was a bloody nightmare for both sides and another tightening loop around Japan's neck. By early 1945, the U.S. Strategic Air Force was able to launch waves of B-29 bombers from the Mariana Islands to set Tokyo and Japan's major cities ablaze. But these sorties flew over distances that were too long, lacking refueling points and emergency airfields for damaged planes or those hit by anti-aircraft fire. The U.S. military needed a closer springboard to continue its strategic bombing campaign without heavy losses, and they chose Iwo Jima as the target. The small volcanic island, less than 21 square kilometers in size, lay alone in the gray-blue ocean about 1,200 kilometers south of Tokyo and became a strategic focal point. Capturing Iwo Jima meant gaining a forward airfield where fighters could escort B-29s and crippled bombers could land on their way back. For Japan, Iwo Jima was a vital defensive outpost, the final gate blocking the enemy's advance, the fragile shell shielding the homeland from the storm of steel. No one in Tokyo wanted to imagine what would happen if even Iwo Jima fell. On the island, starting in the spring of 1944, one man quietly prepared a nightmare for the enemy. That was Lieutenant General Kuribayashi Tadamichi, newly appointed by Tokyo to organize the defense. He fully understood America's overwhelming power and knew the fate of Iwo Jima was only a matter of time. But with loyalty and an unyielding samurai spirit, he turned that time into an opportunity to make the island a deadly fortress. For nearly a year, more than 20,000 Japanese soldiers under Kuribayashi dug into the hard volcanic rock, creating a maze of tunnels stretching over 18 kilometers with thousands of underground bunkers 10 to 20 meters deep, connecting fortified pillboxes and strongpoints. Mount Suribachi, at the island's southern tip, was hollowed out into layered caves housing ammunition depots, field hospitals, and barracks, all deep enough to withstand relentless bombing. Heavy artillery, mortars, and machine guns were hidden inside caves with sliding doors, firing and then closing up to avoid counter-battery fire. On the surface, hundreds of machine gun nests, anti-tank traps, and mines were carefully camouflaged among rocks and sand, making them very hard to detect. Unlike Japan's traditional beach-line defense, Kuribayashi ordered his men not to fire when the Americans landed, avoiding futile sacrifice on the beaches. He allowed the U.S. forces to come ashore freely and then unleashed coordinated fire, turning every meter of ground into a hunting field and every bunker into a trap. He told his soldiers, each man must kill at least 10 enemies before he dies. The Americans assembled an enormous force for the operation codenamed Detachment. About 70,000 elite Marines from 3 divisions under General Holland Smith gathered on hundreds of landing ships. The U.S. Navy committed massive firepower with more than 500 warships, including 7 battleships, 16 aircraft carriers, and hundreds of destroyers and cruisers, forming a gigantic fleet encircling the island. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz personally commanded the entire operation. By late 1944, U.S. aircraft began carpet bombing Iwo Jima for 74 consecutive days, the longest sustained bombardment in the entire Pacific War. For 3 days before the landing, battleships and cruisers continued shelling, pouring tens of thousands of large-caliber shells onto the ground, shaking the island and filling the air with thick smoke and dust. American troops watching from the ships believed the place had been thoroughly destroyed and that no fighting force could have survived. Yet the reality was far from simple. Dawn of February 19th, 1945. The sea was calm, the sky hung gray, heavy with the smell of salt and gunpowder. Off the coast of Iwo Jima, the U.S. fleet stood in formation, ready. On the decks of the battleships, 356mm naval guns roared to life, unleashing their final salvos onto the island to clear the beaches. Thick smoke billowed upward, shrouding the silhouette of Mount Suribachi. From the early hours, tens of thousands of U.S. Marines stood in position inside hundreds of landing vehicle-tracked craft, rocking in the swell. Packed shoulder to shoulder in the swaying holds, many young Marines vomited from seasickness and nerves. There was no chatter, only the metallic clink of gear in the silence. Some quietly struck matches and burned letters from home they had never managed to send, fearing they would have no other chance to destroy them and not wanting personal papers to fall into Japanese hands. A few young recruits pulled out photographs of their families, gazing at them one last time before the assault, swallowing their fear. On the command ship's bridge, General Holland Smith checked his pocket watch. It was H hour. He gave the order firmly. Launch! Hundreds of LVTs pulled away from the mother ships, cutting through the waves toward the southern shore of Iwo Jima. At 8:59 a.m., the first wave of U.S. Marines reached land. The tracks of the LVTs dug into the distinctive black volcanic sand. Marines leapt from their craft, wading through waist-deep water to reach the shore. They spread out quickly, moving behind sand mounds and securing the beach. Everything was eerily quiet. There was no defensive gunfire at all. The beach was littered with bomb craters and charred rubble. A few U.S. officers looked surprised but pleased. The leading units immediately pressed forward, trying to seize key positions before the Japanese could react. Marines whispered to each other, "The Japs must all be dead in their tunnels." Spirits lifted, and many believed this battle would be easy. They were wrong. At exactly 9:12 a.m., the ground beneath the Marines began to tremble. From the slopes of Mount Suribachi at the southern end of the island, Japanese artillery and mortars erupted all at once. Hundreds of large-caliber shells fired from hidden caves rained down on the beach. At the same time, countless machine guns, cunningly concealed on high ground, opened up, sweeping the black sand with torrents of fire. The beach of Iwo Jima, quiet just moments before, became hell on earth. Columns of black sand and mangled bodies shot into the air with each deafening explosion. Shouts of "Medic! Corpsman!" rose above the chaos. On the beach, U.S. Marines panicked, desperately looking for cover, but there was nothing. No trenches, no earthworks, just a few Sherman tanks that had barely made it ashore, offering flimsy protection. One group huddled behind the wreckage of a burning amphibious vehicle, shrouded in black smoke. Others flattened themselves in shallow bomb craters, pressing as low as they could as bullets hissed overhead. By the water's edge, dozens already lay still, bodies broken under the relentless shelling. Within minutes, the entire beach was littered with casualties. Iwo Jima's sand had turned into a killing field. The volcanic sand here was black, loose and spongy, sinking to the ankle with every step, making movement painfully slow. Marines trudged under the weight of more than 30 kilograms of weapons, ammunition, and gear. Heat radiated from the island's core, blending with the harsh midday sun to turn the beach into a natural furnace. The wind carried the acrid stench of sulfur, choking like rotten eggs. Gunsmoke and dust thickened into a suffocating haze. Sweat and seawater soaked their uniforms, quickly mixing with dirt and blood into black, sticky patches on their skin. The young men were swiftly reduced to grim, mud-streaked figures staggering through the surreal landscape of hell. Under the punishing fire, the first U.S. assault wave was stopped just a few hundred meters from the water's edge. Sherman tanks tried to advance, but sank deeper with every turn of their tracks, becoming easy targets for Japanese anti-tank guns. Flamethrower tanks were destroyed from a distance before they could bring their weapons to bear. Marine platoons suffered heavy losses and were forced to huddle on a narrow strip of beach barely 200 meters wide. Officers shouted over the explosions, ordering squads to leapfrog and cover each other to push forward and capture the base of the ridges. Supported by naval, gunfire from offshore, U.S. reinforcements continued to pour men and equipment onto the sand. Wave after wave of troops kept landing on the already shredded beach. With nowhere to hide, the fresh Marines waded straight into the inferno ahead, taking the places of comrades who had just fallen. By the end of February 19, approximately 30,000 American troops had landed on the island, but most remained trapped on the narrow strip of southern beach. The United States forces had secured only a small beachhead, less than 1 kilometer wide and only a few hundred meters deep, far short of their objectives. Every inch of ground gained came at a staggering cost. On the first day alone, about 600 American Marines were killed and 1,800 wounded. This single day of losses exceeded the total U.S. casualties sustained over several months of the Guadalcanal campaign. Among those who fell was Sergeant John Basilone, one of the Marine Corps' most celebrated heroes and recipient of the Medal of Honor. Basilone was killed on the black sand while leading his men in an assault to destroy an enemy machine gun nest. His sacrifice on the very first day foreshadowed the horrific price the Marines would have to pay to capture this island. As night fell, American commanders were forced to order a halt to the advance. The Marines hurriedly dug makeshift foxholes right in the sand, the living huddled next to the dead as they braced to hold through the night. Offshore, cruisers began firing illumination rounds continuously, casting an eerie greenish light over the island's desolate ruins. In that flickering glow, the beach, pitted with shell holes and scattered with bodies, looked like a newly made graveyard. The first night on Iwo Jima was truly a nightmare. The faint moans of the dying drifted across the darkened beach. Somewhere among the sand craters, badly wounded, Marines gasped for their mothers in delirium, sending chills through their comrades who listened helplessly. No one dared crawl out to drag them back to aid stations, as Japanese snipers hidden in the darkness fired at any head that rose above the holes. In their fevered agony, some Marines wept, sobbing out the names of wives and children back home before they went silent. War correspondent Robert Sherrod, present on the island, wrote that the first night on Iwo Jima felt like a nightmare at the very gates of hell. By dawn, one could see countless hands, legs, heads, and skulls lying far from the rest of their bodies. In just one night, the Black Beach had become littered with dismembered remains, a horrifying sight that would haunt even the most battle-hardened Marines. At dawn on February 20th, American forces again came under a new wave of Japanese shelling, but this time they were ready to respond. At exactly 7 a.m., the naval guns offshore roared back, unleashing a storm of fire on the exposed Japanese positions. Around 8 a.m., Marine battalions began launching their first assaults beyond the beachhead. According to plan, the 5th Marine Division sent the 28th Regiment to encircle Mount Suribachi from the left flank, on the island's southwest corner, while the 4th and 3rd Marine Divisions spread out to the right and center, pushing northward to seize the 2 airfields and the rest of the island. From here, the battle entered its most brutal phase, a fight for every inch of ground against an enemy that was both tenacious and hidden. The Americans quickly realized that targets they thought had been flattened by 74 days of bombardment were still intact and firing back fiercely. The Japanese's intricate tunnel system allowed most of their garrison to survive even the heaviest artillery barrages. They now popped up unexpectedly from unseen positions, firing into the Americans' backs before disappearing underground again. Each resistance point was only silenced when it was directly destroyed with explosives or flamethrowers. One American officer bitterly remarked that they were fighting the whole island itself. as every cave, rock, and bush could open fire into their backs. On the southern left flank, Mount Suribachi loomed like a natural fortress, dominating the entire beachhead and needing to be taken at all costs. The 28th Marine Regiment was ordered to capture the 170-meter high volcanic peak as quickly as possible. Throughout February 20th, companies began circling up the slopes, inching up the barren, steep ridges. Above them, the Japanese clung to countless caves dug deep into the mountain, from which they unleashed machine gun, mortar, and grenade fire that rained down relentlessly. The treacherous terrain and interlinked cave networks turned the mountain into a deadly labyrinth. The Marines had to fight for every meter, every cave mouth. For 2 straight days, machine guns from above tore into the slopes, and grenades rolled down like thunder. In response, the Marines called in 105mm artillery and mortars to blast the cave mouths, and carried M2 flamethrowers to the entrances to spew flames inside. Screams echoed, then fell silent as each pocket of resistance was burned out. Some caves were too deep to reach with flamethrowers, so the Marines resorted to hauling in 20 to 30 kilogram satchels of explosives, lighting the fuses and shoving them deep inside to blow the entrances apart, burying the defenders alive. Bit by bit, the rocks of Mount Suribachi cracked under the relentless bombardment, and the Japanese soldiers inside were burned or entombed one by one in the darkness. On the morning of February 23rd, the encirclement of Mount Suribachi was finally complete. After fighting through the night, American Marines at last reached the summit of the volcanic mountain. A few isolated Japanese positions still fired back from small caves near the top, leading to brief, chaotic hand-to-hand skirmishes in the dark tunnels. Some remaining Japanese soldiers, knowing there was no way out, chose to end their lives with grenades rather than be captured alive. At precisely 10:15 that morning, the American flag was raised by a group of 6 United States Marines atop the smoke-shrouded peak of Suribachi. Amid the devastation, that small red, white, and blue banner flapped in the sulphurous wind, becoming the first foreign flag to fly over Japanese soil during the war. Below at the foot of the mountain, many Marines lowered their weapons and looked up at that moment with swelling pride. Cheers erupted across the southern battle lines, a sign of victory in the midst of long, grim days. Some wept, believing the ordeal was finally nearing its end. But that fleeting joy could not erase the harsh reality. The battle was far from over. In truth, of the 6 Marines who planted the flag on Mount Suribachi, 3 would be dead just weeks later on this very island. The sight of the American flag flying over Suribachi signaled that the southern sector of Iwo Jima was now under U.S. control. However, the northern part of the island, nearly 3/4 of its area, remained firmly in Japanese hands. There, the Japanese had constructed their main line of defense, an extraordinarily strong network of interconnected tunnels and deeply layered fortifications. No sooner had the elation at Suribachi faded than the Marines were forced to confront an even grimmer challenge ahead. They reformed their ranks and pushed northward, determined to end the battle. But the terrain ahead was a nightmare, barren and jagged, crowded with ridges, rocky outcrops, trenches, and fortifications. Everywhere, death lay in wait. The final days of February into early March 1945 were the bloodiest at Iwo Jima. The Marines advanced slowly, peeling away each layer of the Japanese defenses in the most literal sense. Along the way, they encountered cold, anonymous names on the map that became living nightmares: Hill 382, Hill 362A, nameless smoky valleys. Every elevation was a fortress, a cluster of pillboxes and bunkers linked below ground by tunnels. These defensive clusters were interlocked and mutually supporting, forming a deadly web that the Marines grimly nicknamed the meat grinder. From hidden firing slits carved into the cliffs, Japanese machine guns wove intersecting curtains of fire, cutting down any figure that strayed into the open. From above, mortars from unseen positions rained shells onto the advancing Marines. The ground shook, dust and smoke turned everything to chaos, and many men became disoriented, unable to tell where the enemy fire was coming from. On some days, the American advance could be measured in mere meters. They clawed forward, fighting for every earthen mound, every blood-soaked trench edge. When the dust finally settled, between the positions just taken and those left behind was a stretch of ground slick with blood, strewn with shell fragments, spent cartridges, and the lifeless bodies of both sides. Casualties on both sides mounted exponentially. The Japanese fought with unyielding tenacity, almost never retreating, but at staggering cost. Many Japanese platoons fought to the last man, turning their positions into mass suicide sites. The Japanese 145th Regiment, for example, was nearly wiped out after just 2 days of combat against the U.S. 3rd Marine Division, with most of its officers and soldiers killed. On the American side, entire Marine companies charging through narrow valleys were cut to pieces by dense Japanese fire within hours. On February 26th alone, at Hill 382, the U.S. 4th Marine Division suffered 792 dead in a single blood-soaked day. The losses were so great that evening, American news outlets published casualty figures that shocked the public. Back home, some newspapers began to ask whether such a terrible price was worth paying for such a tiny, nameless island. But half a world away, on the battlefield, the men who fought had no time to ponder the strategic value of their sacrifice. They knew only that if they wanted to leave Iwo Jima alive, they had to fight, and they had to win. Facing that earthly hell, the United States forces were forced to change their tactics. Daytime frontal assaults proved far too costly, as the Japanese could clearly observe and destroy every attack from a distance. Therefore, the Americans switched to a more cautious and surprising approach. During the day, they unleashed maximum firepower, using everything from naval guns and bombers to flamethrowers and directional mines to wear down the enemy. At night, American commando teams silently crawled past the front lines, slipping into Japanese bunkers under the cover of darkness. Using bayonets, daggers, and grenades, they plunged deep into the tunnels, spreading terror among the defenders. Many Japanese strongholds were wiped out quietly in this way, before the enemy could fire a single shot. These night attacks proved effective, helping the Americans break through some of the toughest links in the defensive chain. However, the price in human lives was still unavoidable. Soldiers from both sides clashed day and night, exhausted in the endless cycle of life and death. The Marines who survived each battle had to watch their comrades fall one after another. They gradually became numb to the carnage. Their emotions dulled, their faces blank, moving like soulless machines through the meat grinder. At the same time, the Japanese did not sit idly by, awaiting death. Night after night, Japanese suicide squads slipped through secret tunnels to strike at the American rear. Japanese soldiers often removed their boots and wore black socks to crawl low to the ground in the darkness. They exploited hidden underground passages to suddenly emerge behind American lines, then strike supply depots or artillery positions. Some American sentries were killed silently, enemy soldiers cutting throats with daggers or lunging bayonets through their backs without a sound. On some nights, Japanese troops even hurled grenades into a makeshift American command post, then vanished before return fire could reach them. The enemy's ghostly presence kept the Americans in a constant state of tension, robbing them of sleep. Even the faintest rustle in the dark could trigger a panicked burst of gunfire, sometimes hitting their own men. The nights on Iwo Jima were anything but quiet, filled instead with savage, silent little battles that drained the spirit of both sides. By early March, the situation for the Japanese defenders had grown truly desperate. They had lost most of their strategic positions and had been forced to retreat into the northern corner of the island. Casualties mounted daily, with no reinforcements in sight. Worse still, food and water supplies were running out. Iwo Jima had no rivers or streams. The only water for the Japanese came from rainwater tanks stored underground, and now even those were empty. After days trapped in suffocating tunnels, thirst became more terrifying than bombs. Some Japanese soldiers, driven mad by thirst, risked crawling out to the dry wells at night in search of a few cups of rainwater. Most were picked off by American snipers the moment they emerged. Yet even when all hope was gone and there was no way out, the Japanese soldiers still showed no sign of surrender. The Bushido Code and their deep loyalty to the emperor ran too deep. To die in battle was glory, while surrender was shame. Many wounded Japanese lying in the tunnels pulled grenade pins to kill themselves rather than be captured alive when they heard the Americans approaching. Others pretended to surrender with a white flag, only to detonate explosives strapped to their bodies as the Marines drew near, taking their enemies with them. These brutal tricks made it clear to the Americans that this battle would see no prisoners, only the last man left standing. General Kuribayashi, the Japanese commander, remained alive and continued to direct the defense from a command post buried 30 meters underground. He had commanded the battle from that bunker from the very beginning, steadfastly rejecting any thought of surrender. But by March 14th, with less than 1/3 of the island still under Japanese control, Kuribayashi knew the end was near. He sent a message to Tokyo. "We have lost most of our artillery, tanks, and 2/3 of our officers. The remaining positions can resist for a few more days. But even if these positions fall, the survivors will continue to fight to the end. We are deeply grieved that we could not defend the island." That same day, Kuribayashi ordered his subordinates to burn the flag of the 145th Regiment, the main Japanese unit defending the island, so that the Americans could not capture its regimental colors. By that time, the 145th Regiment was reduced to fewer than a single surviving company. On March 17th, Imperial Headquarters issued a special order promoting Kuribayashi from lieutenant general to full general at the front, in recognition of his indomitable spirit. Several other officers on the island were also posthumously promoted one rank. Yet these final honors could not change the grim reality. On the night of March 17th, Kuribayashi sent his final message to Imperial General Headquarters. "The battle is nearing its end, not because the spirit of His Majesty's army has faltered, but because we have completely exhausted our ammunition and food supplies. We have been without drinking water for 5 days now. All who remain will carry out one final counterattack. I believe Japan will not be safe unless we recapture this island. I pray that my spirit may guide a future counterattack. May the heavens grant our homeland the ultimate victory." The message ended with several lines of solemn, heroic poetry composed by Kuribayashi himself, including the haunting verse, "Our ammunition spent, our bodies broken, mission unfulfilled, how bitter it is. I will be reborn 7 times, to take up arms against the enemy again." These verses clearly expressed his resolve to fight to the very last breath. After sending his farewell orders, on the night of March 17th, Kuribayashi ordered all remaining Japanese units to prepare for the final battle. He told his subordinates, "From 12:01 a.m. on March 18, 1945, everyone will fight to the death. No one is permitted to think of preserving their own life." That cold order was passed down to the last scattered groups of Japanese soldiers clinging to their caves and tunnels. They all understood this would be the final fight of their lives. The remaining soldiers quietly sharpened their bayonets, cleaned their pistols, and wrote last letters to their families, then tucked them into their breast pockets. They prepared to die. On the night of March 25, 1945, darkness shrouded Iwo Jima. After several days of eerie silence, suddenly Japanese drums began to pound out a relentless rhythm. About 300 Japanese soldiers still alive gathered silently in the night, using a hidden tunnel to slip close to airfield number 2 in the center of the island. With no artillery or tanks left to support them, The Japanese lined up carrying whatever weapons they still had: rifles, bayonets, grenades, samurai swords, and even wooden staves soaked in gasoline. Many were already wounded, their heads bandaged in white, their eyes burning with the fire of desperation. Just past midnight, they suddenly charged en masse toward the American positions near the airfield. The cry of banzai, their final battle cry, rose into the night. A terrifying sight unfolded. Black shapes surged up from the earth, screaming and hurled themselves at the American camp behind the front lines. This was the area housing American pilots, engineers, and logistics troops who were not directly engaged on the front. Caught completely by surprise, many American soldiers were stabbed to death in their sleep by cold steel bayonets. Others, panicked, grabbed rifles or whatever they could find and ran out into the chaotic night. Gunfire cracked at point-blank range, grenades exploded with deafening force, and screams filled the air. The Japanese soldiers slashed, stabbed, hurled grenades, and fired wildly into the tents. The American troops fought back desperately, but they were caught completely off guard, and the scene descended into utter chaos. Under the dim, patchy glow of flares, shadowy figures wrestled, stabbed, lunged with bayonets, and fought to the death in the darkness. Not until near dawn on March 26th did the United States forces finally restore order. The frontline Marine Corps units immediately dispatched mobile forces to rescue Airfield No. 2. After several hours of fierce fighting, the Japanese suicide charge was completely repelled. As daylight broke, the final battle on Iwo Jima came to an end. More than 200 Japanese soldiers who had joined the desperate attack lay dead, their bodies piled in a corner of the airfield. The Americans also suffered heavy losses, more than 100 dead and 200 wounded in that chaotic night alone. But the final Japanese resistance had been crushed. On the morning of March 26, 1945, the U.S. command officially declared Iwo Jima secured. After 36 consecutive days of fighting, the American flag was raised once again on a northern hilltop, marking the complete victory of the campaign. The Japanese commander, General Kuribayashi, did not join his men in the final suicide charge. He is believed to have chosen a solitary death in the spirit of a samurai. At dawn on March 26th, Kuribayashi and a single aide quietly left the command bunker. The two of them walked silently to an open area facing north, toward their distant homeland. Kuribayashi wore his dress uniform, adorned with medals, and drew his officer's sword. Facing home, he solemnly bowed 3 times toward the emperor. Then he knelt, removed his cap, and thrust his blade into his abdomen, slicing across in a fatal stroke, performing seppuku with honor. His aide, weeping, swung his sword down on his commander's neck to complete the ritual as ordered. Kuribayashi Tadamichi died as he had vowed, never to fall into enemy hands, fighting to his last breath. The aide buried his commander's body in a makeshift grave at the site, then turned his pistol on himself. When American forces reached the area, they found only a few broken swords and the scattered bodies of Japanese soldiers among the rubble. Kuribayashi's body was never positively identified by the Americans. He remained forever part of the island, as one with the tragic battle he had led. When the final gunfire fell silent, Iwo Jima returned to its eerie, desolate quiet, but now it was the haunting stillness of a deadly island. The sun rose high over a ghastly scene. Corpses and body parts littered the ground. The surviving American engineers began clearing the battlefield. They hastily planted wooden markers over mass graves in the sand, burying both comrades and fallen Japanese alike. The entire island reeked of death, acrid gunpowder, and the natural sulfur rising from the earth. Bodies lay scattered in trenches, curled in dark caves like soulless dolls. Many were mangled, twisted atop the black sand, stained red with dried blood. The surviving Americans walked silently through the devastation with hollow eyes. A young soldier collapsed beside his best friend's corpse, wordless, his trembling hand resting on his friend's shoulder one last time. On their smoke-streaked, hardened faces, no tears would come anymore. This tiny island, its rocky shores steeped in sulfur, had become a vast, unmarked cemetery. Among the bodies of both Americans and Japanese, letters and diaries were found, bloodied and unfinished, just like the lives of the men who lay there. The Battle of Iwo Jima, which raged for 5 weeks, ended with victory for the United States. This hellish island was liberated at a terrible price. The Americans reported about 6,800 dead and 19,000 wounded at Iwo Jima, most of them Marines. This was the only battle in Marine Corps history in which U.S. casualties exceeded those of the enemy, even though nearly 3 times as many Japanese soldiers died. Indeed, out of approximately 21,000 Japanese defenders, around 18,000 perished, many by their own hand. Only 216 Japanese soldiers were taken prisoner when the battle ended, most of them too badly wounded or unconscious to resist. About 1,000 others survived in hiding in the tunnels, continuing scattered resistance for months before finally surrendering. In terms of ferocity, Iwo Jima is remembered as one of the bloodiest battles in modern warfare. American casualties on Iwo Jima alone exceeded Allied losses on D-Day at Normandy. This small volcanic island in the Pacific became a symbol of the brutal intensity of the US-Japan conflict. The victory at Iwo Jima opened the direct path to Japan's doorstep for the Americans, but the losses here sent chills even through the victors. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz praised, "Among the men who fought on Iwo Jima, uncommon valor was a common virtue. Indeed, soldiers on both sides displayed extraordinary courage in the most horrific of wars." The American flag flying over Mount Suribachi became a symbol of the U.S. fighting spirit, later immortalized in a memorial in Washington, D.C. Yet behind that heroic symbol lay an unbearably painful cost. Iwo Jima, Sulphur Island in Japanese, has forever etched its name in history as a hell on earth. Deep within the island, its cold, empty tunnels and fortifications now stand as silent witnesses. Perhaps somewhere, the hopeless prayers and dying whispers of those soldiers still echo faintly in the sea breeze. All of it remains a stark reminder to future generations of the terrible destruction of war and of the sacrifices that must never be forgotten on the fiery, blood-soaked island of Iwo Jima.